Archangel Michael says, "Your mother who is in heaven sent this through God. She's been trying to reach you for 3 days. This is exactly what she wanted to tell you. Open this before it's too late." Archangel Michael says, "There are moments when the distance between heaven and earth becomes so thin that the words of love and warning can pass through like light through the smallest crack. For the past 3 days, the gates of heaven have trembled with her urgency. She has stood at the edge, her hands reaching, her eyes searching for you, her heart heavy with the weight of what she needs you to know. The message is not small, it is not something that can be delayed, hidden, or forgotten. The air around you has shifted, whether you've noticed or not. Your nights have been disturbed, your dreams interrupted, your thoughts strangely pulled toward moments and memories you thought you had locked away. It is her, your mother, pressing against the veil, trying to get you to listen. 3 nights ago, the first attempt came. You may not have realized it, but the sudden coldness in the room, the flicker in the light, the faint scent of something familiar, perhaps her perfume, perhaps the smell of something she used to cook, was not random. It was her arrival, just for a moment, to see if your heart was open enough to receive what she carried. She is not here to frighten you. She is here to protect you, and yet, the reason for her visit is wrapped in a warning that cannot wait much longer. Her words are not just a whisper from beyond, they are a command from God Himself, delivered through her love for you, her child. On the second day, her presence grew more intense. You may have found yourself speaking out loud without thinking, saying words that felt like they were pulled from somewhere else. You may have woken at an unusual hour, unable to explain the rush of emotion that clung to your chest. This was not your imagination, it was her voice brushing against your spirit, testing the barrier between her world and yours. In heaven, time is different. But urgency is still real. He knew he did not rest until he read you. She knew that something was coming toward you that only a mother's warning could shield you from, and she knew that she needed God's permission to break through in this way. That permission was granted, and for 3 days she has been moving between realms, guided by angels, desperate to hand you this truth. Today is the final day. If you hear this now, it means you have not missed your moment to receive it. The angels are holding the path open, but not for long. The truth she carries is heavy, but it comes wrapped in the same love she gave you when she was alive. She has seen the choices you are about to make. And she has seen the consequences they will bring if you walk forward without guidance. In her eyes, you are still the child she held close, the life she once protected with her own hands. She is not speaking to the world. This message is not for anyone else's ears, it is for you alone, as if she is sitting beside you, looking straight into your eyes, telling you what no one else will. She has watched you struggle, and she has wept over the pain you have carried in silence. But now she comes with more than comfort, she comes with an urgent, divine instruction. When she left this earth, she did not leave you. Every heartbeat since then had been measured with her prayers, every tear you've shed had been seen and gathered. She has followed your life with a love undiminished by distance, untouched by death. But now, something has happened in your life, something she cannot ignore. Heaven has shown her what is approaching, and she has begged God to let her warn you before it arrives. You may not feel ready to hear this, but she says you must. Her message begins with a memory. She takes you back to a moment when you were much younger, a time when you felt completely safe because she was near. She wants you to remember that feeling because the storm ahead will try to make you forget it. But you must hold on to it, because that memory will remind you of her unbreakable promise: she will never stop protecting you. A warning is this: someone close to you, someone you have trusted, is not as they seem. They have been moving in ways that will harm you, smiling in your face while planning in the shadows. She has seen their intentions, and they are not pure. This is not paranoia. This is not ververversig. She says that if you ignore this, their actions will cause a ripple effect that will take years to repair. They are already speaking to others about you in ways that twist the truth. They are trying to position themselves to take something that belongs to you, something she says you have earned through hardship and perseverance. She is telling you to act now, not later. She says you must not confront them directly, for they would only twist the situation further. Instead, she tells you to quietly secure what is yours, to take measures that ensure nothing can be stolen without your knowledge. This may be your reputation, your work, your property, or even your peace of mind. She warns that in the coming days, there will be a conversation where this person will try to make you feel guilty. They will dress their words in concern, but beneath it will be manipulation. She says you must recognize the difference between genuine care and disguised control. Archangel Michael stands beside her as she speaks. His sword is drawn not for violence, but for protection. He says her love is the reason this message is being allowed through. Not every soul is permitted to speak this clearly from heaven, but a mother's petition is one of the most powerful forces in existence. She does not want you to live in fear, she wants you to walk with awareness. She says the danger is real, but so is your ability to overcome it. She says you have a choice right now that will decide the shape of the next chapter of your life. In the quiet hours tonight, she will come again not as a shadow or a fleeting scent, but as a warmth that covers you like a blanket. If you are still enough, if you are open, you will hear her. Not in the way you hear the world, but in the way the soul hears the truth. Her words will settle in you like a seed. And in time that seed will bloom into clarity and strength. Her final plea is this: trust what you feel when you think of her. That is where her presence is most alive, and know that the love she carries for you is not bound by distance, death, or time. This is her message, delivered through Archangel Michael, sealed with God's authority, and carried by the love that has never left you. She says you are stronger than the danger ahead, but only if you listen now. If you wish to express your support further, you have the option to give super thanks, with contributions of up to $1.20. Archangel Mitchell says, your mother has been trying to reach you for 3 days and the windows of mercy are still open. She chose this moment because your heart is finally quiet enough to hear her. She asks you to sit, breathe, and let every word become a warm hand on your shoulder. She knows the room you are in, and the echo of your steps on the floor. She remembers the cup on the table and the way you hold it with both hands. She sees the light on the wall, and she wants you to know you are not alone in it. She says there is something she could not say before she left. The words hid behind the pain and the noise of hospital machines. The words are simple and they are waiting like folded letters in a drawer. He says she is proud of you. She says she watched you grow a courage that you do not always recognize. She says the courage is older than your fear and gentler than your doubts. She speaks about the day you almost gave up. He saw the weight on your chest and the tightness in your jaw. She counted your breaths and whispered strength into the space between them. she says your laughter still fills her. She remembers the way it used to spill down hallways and out into the yard. She says the world needs that sound from you again. She wants you to forgive yourself for the delays and the detours. She says the map you carried was not wrong. It was simply drawn with hills you could not see from the start. She says every step you took still brought you here. She tells you about the box under your memories. In that box there is a list of things you promised yourself. She says take out that list and choose one promise to keep tonight. She says the house does not feel the same without her voice. She says that is natural and it is proof of love. She says fill it with your voice and the house will learn your song. She asks you to make the small repairs you keep postponing. The loose handle, the flickering bulb, the stack of unread mail. She says each repair is a boat for your future. She remembers the smell of the first rain and your excitement when the sky broke open. She says your spirit is like that rain and it washes worry from dry ground. She says drink from that sky again. She talks about your kindness and how you hide it when the world seems sharp. She says do not hide it anymore. She says your kindness is armor and lantern in the same breath. She says there is a lever you never sent. She says write it tonight and burn it if you must. She says the release will open a window inside your chest. She remembers your small victories and wants you to count them again. She says count them like beads between your fingers. She says each bead is a reason you will not break. She says the dream you had last week was a doorway and not a puzzle. She says walk through it with both feet and your head high. She says on the other side is a field with your name on it. She talks about the photo that makes you cry. She says keep it and let it be a blessing. She says tears are water for seeds you have not noticed yet. She says you heard the words people used against you. She says those words cannot define the shape of your life. She says your life is shaped by the love you carry and the work you do. She says you are allowed to rest. She says rest is not a delay. It is a tool. She says your strength returns when you honor your limits. She speaks of the kitchen and the smell of spices you both love. She says make that meal again. She says the taste will bring back a warmth that unlocks a door within you. She says there is a gift hidden inside the thing you fear most. She says fear often guards what matters. She says take the key that is your courage and open that gate. She remembers the time you stood up for someone who had no voice. She says heaven noticed that day. She says that act placed a star above your path. She talks about forgiveness as a gentle broom. She says sweep the corners of the house of your heart. She says dust will rise and then settle as light. She says the apology you deserve may never arrive. She says release your hope of hearing it. She says your freedom does not require their confession. She says your hands are good hands. She says they heal when they hold and they build when they move with purpose. She says trust what they can do. She remembers a song you hum without thinking. She says sing it out loud tonight. She says the air around you will blow with quiet relief. She says there is a window you rarely open. She says open it and let morning enter, even at night. She says faith can look like fresh air in a stale room. She speaks of your name and how she chose it or blessed it. She says your name carries meaning that you forget on heavy days. She says say your name softly and let it steady you. She says the mirror does not show everything. She says it cannot hold the bright edges of your spirit. She says look anyway and speak kindly to the person you see. She remembers the first time you told the truth even though it shook your hands. She says that same bravery lies in you now. She says it is ready to rise when you call it. She says the next chapter begins with one small action. She says choose one shelf to tidy or one call to make. She says completion invites momentum. She talks about the night sky and how it listens without judgment. She says step outside and lift your eyes. She says the sky will teach you how to hold both grief and hope. She says grief is a river that knows the way home. She says you do not have to swim every day. She says some days you can sit by the bank and watch the water pass. She says love did not end for her when her birth ended. She says love changed rooms and learned to speak without a mouth. She says that language surrounds you now. She remembers the mistake you carry like a stone. She says stones belong in gardens and on paths. She says place the stone beside the gate and walk past it. She says you have a gift for turning small resources into steady progress. She says do it again with what you have today. She says the door opens for those who knock with consistency. He talks about the 3 days he tried to reach you. She says day 1 was a whisper against your busyness. She says day 2 was a dream you all just remembered. She says day 3 is this message arriving like morning light under a door. She says receive it and let the room brighten. She says you will feel a warmth in your chest that stays. She says you will soon notice patterns falling away. She says the old cycle will not hold you much longer. She says a new rhythm wants to carry your steps. She remembers the promises she made to you. She says some promises are now yours to keep for yourself. She says keep them with grace and not with pressure. She says put a glass of water beside your bed tonight. She says before you sleep, thank your body for carrying you. She says in the morning, drink from that glass and begin again. She speaks of your work and the dignity inside it. She says measure your days by integrity and not by applause. She says the right eyes will see at the right time. She says generosity is a seed that returns as shade. She says keep giving in ways that do not harm you. She says say yes with wisdom and no with peace. She remembers the letter you found in her handwriting. She says it was meant to reach you on an ordinary day. She says ordinary days are the best soil for miracles. She says do not compare your chapter to someone else's. She says you do not know their margins or their edits. She says your story reads well when you read it slowly. She says your silence can be a sanctuary. She says you sit to listen to the gentle voice in your chest. She says that voice will never humiliate you. She says there is a call you will receive soon. She says answer with calm and not with fear. She says you will know what to say when the moment arrives. She says a friend will need your steadiness. She says offer it without burning yourself. She says balance is love that knows its boundaries. She remembers the scent of your hair when you fell asleep in her arms. She says that memory still softens the edges of heaven. She says softness is strength disguised as comfort. She talks about the room where you keep old boxes. She says open one box and keep only what still blesses you. She says release the rest to make space for what is coming. She says time is not your enemy. She says time is a servant that follows vision. She says give it clear instructions and it will obey. She says the door you think is locked will open when you knock with patience. She says try again with a steady hand. She says hinges loosen for those who return with faith. She says your body is asking for water, movement, and sunlight. She says meet those needs like you would for someone you love. She says your energy will gather and rise. She remembers the story you told as a child about a brave traveler. She says you are still that traveler. She says the road is new and the courage is the same. She says your worth is not a prize that others can grant or remove. She says your worth is a birthright and a steady flame. She says guard it, not with fear but with clarity. She says gratitude is a key that opens small doors. She says list 3 things before sleep. She says the list will turn the lock in your favor. She says you will soon find a message tucked in a place you do not expect. She says it will confirm what your heart already knows. She says trust the confirmation and move. She remembers the day you carried groceries for a stranger in the rain. She says kindness like that alters the weather in unseen ways. She says keep being that kind of climate change. She says your dreams at night will grow gentler as you make these shifts. She says the heavy images will lighten. She says dawn will feel more welcoming. She says you will feel her around your left shoulder when you need calm. She says it may feel like a warm scarf or a soft weight. She says breathe and let the calm spread. She talks about the plan you doubt. She says outline it on paper, step by step. She says the steps will stare back like obedient servants ready to work. She says you do not have to finish everything today. She says finish one thing that matters. She says completion builds a bridge to the next action. She remembers the holiday that went sideways and how you still managed to laugh. She says that laugh rescued the day. She says keep that rescue inside your pocket. She says the old wound will itch before it heals. She says do not scratch it with familiar habits. She says cover it with clean bandages of new choices. She says there is a book you meant to read. She says open it for 10 minutes tonight. She says wisdom arrives in small servings that nourish for a long time. She says trust the quiet invitations that keep repeating. She says they are not random. She says they are coordinates to a place where your spirit breathes easily. She says you will not miss your moment. She says the moment carries your signature and cannot be claimed by another. She says you are walking toward it even now. She speaks of apology you owe yourself. She says say it in the mirror with kindness. She says accept it as if from a dear friend. She says practice saying no without a paragraph of reasons. She says simple no is holy ground. She says the right people will respect it. She remembers your first steps in your first fall. He says the fall did not define the walking. She says get up again in the same spirit. She says your patience is about to be rewarded. She says harvest often looks like a door opening quietly. She says listen for the click and step through. She says you will meet someone who sees you with gentle accuracy. She says allow yourself to be seen. She says partnership grows where honesty lines. She says put a flower on the table, even a small one. She says beauty helps the soul take deeper breaths. She says little beauty brings big steadiness. She says your heart knows how to stretch without tearing. She says let it stretch to include your own needs. She says that is not selfishness, that is balance. She says the memory that stings will soften. She says you will be able to hold it without bleeding. She says that day is nearer than you think. She says a door you closed was the right door. She says do not rehearse regret. She says rehearse gratitude for what you protected. She says write your values on a page and place it where you will see it. She says decide with those values and not with fear. She says the path will clear under your feet. She remembers your last conversation and the words left unsaid. She says fill the silence now with love. She says love crosses distance faster than sound. He says she releases you from the pressure you feel to be perfect. She says she never needed perfect, only honest and present. She says be that for yourself. She says your hands can bless your day. She says touch the doorframe as you leave and welcome peace as you return. She says let rituals carry you when willpower is tired. She says you will notice signs that feel like coincidences. She says they are gentle nudges, not commands. She says smile and keep moving with wisdom. She says you can carry her forward by living the lessons she tried to teach. She says do it in your way, not as an imitation. She says your life is the canvas where her love still paints. She says there is a bridge from grief to gratitude, and you are crossing it. She says some planks creak but they hold. He says step steady and look at the horizon sometimes. She says your voice matters in rooms where decisions are made. She says speak once with clarity and calm. She says truth needs no shouting. She remembers the garden you both tended. She says plant something new this week, even if it is in a small pot. She says growth near your window invites growth inside your mind. She says you will feel a sudden urge to clean a drawer or a digital folder. She says follow that urge because order is medicine. She says clear space and your next idea will arrive. She says the old fear of being left behind is losing power. She says you carry your own belonging now. He says where you go home begins. She says you are allowed to celebrate small wins. She says light a candle for a task completed. She says celebration trains the heart to recognize progress. He says you were never the burden you feared you were. She says you were a light in rooms that needed it. She says keep shining without apology. She says the person who misunderstands you will either learn or leave. She says both outcomes make space for peace. She says protect your peace like a priceless serum. She says you will remember a recipe and a story at the same time. She says cook and tell it aloud to the walls. She says the room will feel full again. He says the journey ahead holds gentleness. She says gentleness is not weakness, it is guided strength. She says wear it like a soft armor. She says when you feel the weight return, touch your heart. She says say I am loved and I am guided. She says your cells will understand and loosen. She says money will begin to flow with more order. She says track it without fear and without shame. She says stewardship invites increase. She says offer help without rescuing. She says wisdom knows the difference. She says the difference preserves your energy. She says there is a letter she wanted you to have. She says it is written inside this message. She says it reads I love you, I am with you, keep going. She says you carry her best qualities forward. She says courage, patience, and kindness live in your daily choices. She says these qualities will open rooms no key can refuse. She says trust the timing that looks so. She says roots grow in the dark before green shows. She says trust the quiet work you cannot see. She says fear of failure will wave at you from across the street. she says wave back and keep walking. She says fear has no power unless you stop and invite it in. She says honor your creativity, she says schedule time for it like medicine. She says the world will breathe easier because you made something. She says do not chase love that runs from itself, she says love that is ready will find you standing steady. She says you will know by the peace it brings. She says to forgive the version of you who did not know better, she says that version kept you alive. She says take their hand and walk forward together. She says your future is not a stranger, she says your future already recognizes your footsteps. She says your future is walking to meet you. She says a change in your home will help your mind, he says move a chair, choose a new color, clear shelf. He says shift outside and watch the shift inside. She says your sleep will deepen as you claim these truths, she says dreams will carry messages and symbols you understand. She says you will wake with a plan that feels simple. She says you are safe today, she says tomorrow will be met with the same hands that held you today. She says safety grows where you keep promises to yourself. She says there will be a moment later when you feel a soft chill on your arm. He says it will be your hello. She says say hello back in your heart. She says she does not want you to live in a museum of memories, she says she wants you to build a home of new moments. She says she will visit every room with joy. She says the weight of sorrow will not always be this heavy, she says the muscle of hope is growing under it. She says you will notice your own strength when you live tomorrow. She says keep a small journal by your bed, she says write one sentence before sleep about what was good. She says your mind will learn to scan for light. She says you are forgiven for every time you could not show up, she says you are forgiven for every harsh word you told yourself. She says forgiveness is a door that stays unlocked. She says remember the softness in her voice when she called your name, she says that softness will be your compass. She says follow where it points. She says it is time to release the fear that love will end again, she says love changes form and keeps walking beside you. She says you will see its footprints in daily kindness. She says protect your mornings from noise, she says 5 minutes of silence can anchor the day. She says in those 5 minutes you will hear guidance. She says store a blessing in your pocket in the form of a sentence, she says pull it out when the day tilts hard. He says let it steady the till. She says you will soon look back and see how far you have come. She says the sight will surprise you. She says gratitude will rise like dawn. She says the door is open now, she says step through with your shoulders relaxed and your jaw unclenched. She says she is already in the next room, smiling. She says she loves you in ways that words cannot hold, she says those ways will show up around you as small mercies. She says notice them and keep walking. She says this is the exact message she wanted to deliver, she says it arrives with quiet authority and warm light. She says your life will feel different because you received it. She says keep this message where you can return to it, she says read a few lines on hard days and let them soothe you. She says on good days, share your calm with someone else. She says her goodbye is not an ending, she says it is a handover. She says you will take it from here. She says you are ready, she says you are guided. She says you are loved. If you wish to express your support further, you have the option to give super thanks with contributions of up to $1.20. She says the day begins before sunrise in ways the clock cannot measure. She says your spirit wakes first and invites your body to follow. She says honor that invitation with one simple act that affirms your life. She says the memory of her hands in the morning light still lives in the kitchen drawer. She says take the clean towel and fold it with care as if you are washing your hands. She says if it were a small ceremony. She says ordinary actions become anchors when done with intention. She says the promise you made at the start of the year still waits faithfully. She says promises do not expire when they are rooted in truth. She says return to it with a smile and let momentum gather. She says there is a message hidden in the way leaves move in the wind outside your window. She says the pattern looks random and yet it follows a rhythm. She says your life holds the same rhythm and you feel it when you stop forcing. She says you are stronger than the last time you doubted yourself. She says evidence of that strength is stored in completed days. She says count those days like milestones that line a safe road. She says breathe into the parts of you that hesitate. He says hesitation softens in the presence of patience. She says patience grows when you practice sitting still. She says you are confident in small moments. She says place your feet flat on the floor and sense the support rising to meet you. She says the ground holds you without demanding performance. She says let this be your model for how you hold yourself. She says the words you feed your mind become the shape of your day. She says choose words that build a shelter rather than a cage. She says the shelter travels with you wherever you go. She says you will notice a sudden ease around a task that used to drain you. She says that ease is the result of quiet growth inside your nervous system. She says celebrate the ease and let it spread. She says keep a small envelope for gratitude receipts. She says write down moments of kindness and tuck them inside. She says on hard days the envelope will remind you who you are. She says your future self is already grateful for the boundary you are about to set. He says speak the boundary calmly and keep it steady. She says the right people will adjust around your steadiness. She says you have learned to carry silence without resentment. She says silence now feels like a garden rather than a punishment. She says tend the garden and invite trusted voices into it. She says the sound of your steps at night has become a lullaby to your own heart. She says you can be your own comfort. She says self-comfort is a gift she always wanted you to master. She says the story you tell yourself before sleep writes tomorrow's opening paragraph. She says choose a story that gives your spirit a wide sky. She says the sky expands when you speak with gentle certainty. She says the friend who drifts in and out is still part of your growth. She says some people are seasons and not structures. She says honor the season and release the need for permanence. She says you can sort your life with 3 baskets named keep, transform, and release. She says clarity arrives when you name things honestly. She says honesty is a compass that does not fail. She says you once danced in the living room with no music. She says that kind of freedom heals places that words cannot reach. She says give yourself that medicine again. She says fear often wears the mask of planning and overthinking. She says remove the mask by taking a humble first step. She says humility opens doors that force keep shut. She says your home wants to hear your laughter today. She says even a soft laugh rearranges the air. She says rearranged air makes space for new thoughts. She says choose a sentence to hold in traffic or in lines. She says let it be a simple sentence that points you back to calm. She says calm turns long waits into small retreats. She says you are not behind. She says you are exactly where your wisdom can catch up with your desire. She says a line that feels like breath that finally reaches the bottom of your lungs. She says write your priorities in ink and your schedule in pencil. She says priorities are the bones and schedule is the muscle. She says both are needed and both can be trained. She says you owe yourself a gentle apology for every time you dismissed your needs. She says say it and mean it. She says move forward with cleaner compassion. She says the doorway of the afternoon can be a reset. She says close your eyes for 60 seconds and let the day turn a page. She says pages turn best when you let them rather than force them. She says the task that frightens you is smaller than your imagination has painted it. She says begin at the corner and not at the center. She says corners invite progress without overwhelm. She says the memories that hurt will one day become stories you tell with soft eyes. She says love reshapes pain into wisdom when you live long enough with openness. She says you are doing that work right now. She says interruption can be guidance wearing work clothes. She says look for the usefulness inside it. She says useful interruptions alter your path toward something more fitting. She says pay attention to the objects you touch every day. She says clean them, repair them, and thank them for service. She says respect for tools becomes respect for time. She says allow endings to end. She says do not keep old chapters alive with constant revisiting. She says your energy is needed in the chapter that is opening. She says the apology you gave that was ignored still matters. She says integrity does not require applause. She says keep choosing integrity for the way it cleans the air around you. She says teach your body new evidence of safety. He says dental movement and steady breath are honest teachers. He says your nervous system trusts repeated kindness. She says there is a letter you will write to your future self. She says date it and place it where you will find it on a day that matters. She says your future voice will meet your present voice in gratitude. He says discomfort often precedes expansion. She says expansion makes room for the version of you that matches your calling. She says the fit will feel natural when you arrive. He says trust the people who do what they say more than the ones who say what they will do. She says consistency is a language that does not stutter. She says you speak it well when you honor your word. She says your sleep wants the gift of routine. She says a simple ritual at the same time each night is enough. She says your dreams will grow kinder inside that structure. She says take a short walk even when you do not feel like moving. He says fresh air rearranges the conclusion of the day. She says choose nourishment that respects your life. She says food can be a gentle prayer of care without words. She says you feel different when you eat with gratitude. She says a small savings habit will ease your mind. She says every coin is a vote for future stability. She says stability becomes a quiet helper in creative seasons. She says the person you lost does not abandon you. She says love is a river that finds every bend in your story. She says you are standing by that river even now. She says the dream you carry is patient. He says patience is not laziness. She says patience is strength that refuses to be rushed into mistakes. She says separation from past variants of yourself can feel lonely. She says loneliness is a hallway and not a destination. She says the next room is already being prepared. She says celebrate the courage it takes to turn off your phone. She says attention is a currency that buys back your life. She says invest it in what steadies you. She says your morning words can bless the afternoon you have not met yet. He says speak as if you trust the path that leads to you. She says the path listens and straightens. She says one bookshelf or one folder can become a sanctuary of clarity. She says fill it only with what strengthens your purpose. He says the rest can live somewhere else. She says kindness to strangers returns as unexpected ease. She says the return is not magic. It is the physics of compassion. She says your days move with less friction when you practice it. She says make space on your calendar for unstructured time. He says unstructured time lets your endurance stretch. She says stretched intuition sees path you missed before. She says old fears will stage a small play to keep your attention. He says applaud once and leave the theater. She says the real show is your present life. She says the weight you carry in your shoulders can be taught to leave. She says teach it with breath, movement, and honest rest. She says your body learns fast when you are gentle. She says a letter from an unexpected source will arrive with neutrality. She says respond from your values rather than your first reaction. She says values steady the hand that signs. She says you already know the next right action. She says clarity often hides behind too much input. She says reduce the noise and the answer crosses the room to greet you. She says you are allowed to outgrow rooms that once fit you. She says growth does not insult the past. He says growth thanks the past and walks forward with respect. She says the people who love you are cheering in quiet ways. She says notice the little kindness that keeps showing up. She says these are the flowers on the path. She says release the myth that you must choose between stability and aliveness. She says the two can live in the same house. She says build that house with routines that leave windows open. She says skill grows where attention lingers. She says linger on what matters to your calling. She says the world benefits when you do. She says the fear of visibility fades when you practice being seen in small ways. She says share one honest piece of work and let it stand. She says courage builds a stair under your feet. She says closeness does not require constant communication. She says it requires steady respect and presence when it counts. She says give that and receive that. She says your inner critic learned its script to keep you safe once. She says the danger has passed and the script can be edited. She says write new lines that honor your current truth. She says keep a bowl or a box for found beauty. She says place a leaf, a ticket stub, or a note that made you smile. She says simple beauty trains the eyes to see abundance. She says your yes will mean more when your no is healthy. She says both are tools, not weapons. She says use them with care. She says the effort you invest in your craft is never wasted. She says even grafts that never see daylight strengthen your voice. She says your voice serves others when you keep refining it. She says confusion shrinks when you take a walk and name what you see. She says naming brings you into the room of reality. She says reality is sturdy enough to lean on. She says relief is allowed even before circumstances change. She says relief comes from the belief that you will meet what comes with competence. She says competence grows through small daily care. She says the message you needed at 13 is the message you could give yourself now. She says speak it with tenderness. She says that tenderness travels backward and forward in time. She says your calendar can become an altar of priorities. She says place what matters first and let lesser things share the remaining space. She says order becomes a friend when you invite it in. She says move your body through the doorway of the day as if you chose this life on purpose. She says purpose wakes up when you act like you belong here. She says you belong here fully. She says the thing you postponed for months will take less time than the dread suggested. She says begin and let the truth of its size reveal itself. She says you will smile when you finish. She says gratitude opens the lid on creativity. She says thank what is already working and watch new ideas rise. She says ideas enjoy being thanked. She says remember her laughter and the way it filled a room without asking permission. She says borrow that ease for your own life. She says ease makes space for excellence. She says a quiet morning is an investment with astonishing return. She says even 10 minutes alters the architecture of your day. She says you will feel the design shift. She says you are not obligated to explain your healing to those who do not want to understand. She says you are obligated to continue healing. She says healing becomes your silent contribution. She says practice leaving places a little better than you found them. She says this includes rooms, relationships, and thoughts. She says better is a habit you already know. She says you will notice a gentle courage when you speak your needs next time. She says that courage is the result of this long conversation. She says let the conversation continue inside you. She says your name will be spoken in rooms you have not entered yet. She says your work will arrive before you do. She says prepare by becoming the person who can hold what is coming. She says you can be both soft and structured. She says softness helps you care and structure helps you carry. She says the world trusts people who are both. She says lean into the craft of living well. She says living well is art and discipline married. She says you are already an artist of your days. She says there is joy waiting at the edges of ordinary. He says meet it with unhurried attention. She says attention multiplies joy. She says release the fear of missing out. She says you cannot miss what is meant for your maturity. She says maturity gathers what belongs to it at the right time. She says sleep now and sleep call. She says rest is the full stop that gives meaning to the paragraph. She says new strength will greet you on the next line. She says when you wake, greet the day with the steadiness this message has planted. She says walk with the quiet confidence of someone loved on both sides of the veil. She says she keeps watch with a smile you can feel on your skin like sunlight. She says the courage you practiced yesterday is waiting beside your shoes. She says put it on like a familiar coat before you step outside. She says it will fit better today than it did before. She says your breath can be a lighthouse. She says follow it in and out until the fog lifts. She says lighthouses work because they do the same small thing again and again. She says you are not late to your own life. She says you arrived at the exact minute your wisdom could meet your opportunity. She says the rest of the journey will keep time with your growth. She says hold your head the way she used to hold your face, gently and with approval. She says speak to yourself with the tone you crave from others. She says the echo of that tone will transform your day. She says there is a drawer in your mind filled with half-finished hopes. She says take out one hope and give it a clean beginning. She says beginnings do not need fanfare, only honesty. She says your home is a living instrument. She says tune it with light, air, and kind order. She says every tuned room plays calmer music for your nervous system. She says your energy returns in proportion to the compassion you give yourself. She says compassion is fuel, not decoration. She says drive your day with it and notice the distance you cover. She says release the habit of bracing for impact. She says meet the moment with ready shoulders and a steady jaw. She says readiness is softer and far stronger than bracing. She says a new idea will knock during an ordinary task. She says open the door and offer it a seat at your table. She says write what it says before it wanders off. She says treat your calendar like a garden. She says plant only what you can water. She says harvest peace from realistic planting. She says your attention is a sacred lens. She says point it at what you want to grow. She says the lens is powerful and deserves mindful use. She says a small morning walk can change the story of the afternoon. She says the ground will rearrange your thoughts without argument. She says return home lighter and more sure. She says you are allowed to build a life that fits you now. She says tailor it like a careful seamstress with pins of truth. She says comfort and dignity can live in the same design. She says stop apologizing for needing quiet. She says quiet is where your best answers gather. She says protect that room and use it well. She says grief visits like weather and leaves like weather. She says shelter yourself with simple care while it passes. She says sunlight will return and find you ready. She says your memory of her is a bridge, not a trap. She says cross it to receive love and then cross back to live. She says bridges serve movement, not captivity. She says you can be both decisive and kind. She says kindness toward yourself makes decisions clearer. She says clarity is a kindness to everyone involved. She says your gifts were never meant to be hidden in a drawer. She says place one gift in the window where light can touch it. She says light invites expression. She says your worth does not rise and fall with other people's weather. She says steady yourself inside your values. She says storms can rage and you can still remain upright. She says care for your body today with one deliberate improvement. She says yank why with her coffee or stretch with her screams. She says one improvement trains tomorrow to follow. She says you do not need permission to outgrow what hurts. She says you can bow to the lesson and still walk away. She says your feet already know the path. She says the right companions will recognize the tune of your life. She says you will not need to sing louder for them to hear. She says harmony begins where respect lives. She says choose a corner of your work and polish it to excellence. She says excellence attracts the opportunities that feel like home. She says let your craft introduce you before you enter the room. She says stop keeping score with people who are not playing the same game. She says move your scoreboard to your values and your practice. She says there the numbers tell the truth. She says the next good thing may arrive dressed as a small responsibility. She says accept it with gratitude and discipline. She says small doors open to spacious rooms. She says give your creativity clean tools. She says sharpen pencils, clear a space, and name your project. She says readiness lowers the cost of beginning. She says rest before you feel destroyed. She says rest as maintenance not as emergency repair. She says this single shift will change your health. She says your quiet progress is still progress. She says the seat makes no noise while breaking open. She says keep showing up for the part of you that grows in secret. She says boundaries are bridges that only kind feet can cross. She says mark them with calm language and consistent action. She says kindness will find its way across. She says your life is not a rescue mission. She says your life is a stewardship mission. She says steward your time, relationships, craft, and attention. She says you will soon notice your capacity has increased. She says capacity grows where you choose commitments wisely. He says wise choosing is the true miracle. She says forgive the day for not going perfectly. She says thank the day for going honestly. She says honesty is fertile soil for tomorrow. She says the item you lost will reappear when you stop searching in panic. She says breathe and allow your eyes to soften. He says soft eyes see what tight eyes miss. She says the story you tell about your past can change tone. She says keep the facts and update the meaning. She says updated meaning sets your future free. She says you can hold two truths at once and still walk forward. She says the skill is called maturity. She says you have more of it than you think. She says rehearse success in small, private ways. She says set the table for the life you are building. She says the guest you expect will feel welcome. She says choose mentors by their fruit and not by their noise. She says fruit looks like peace, growth, and integrity. She says your intuition already knows which trees are good. He says take notes on your own courage. She says document moments when you showed up. She says the record will steady you on certain mornings. She says do not confuse urgency with importance. He says important things can be quiet and patient. She says listen for the steady heartbeat beneath the noise. She says let music visit your room today. She says move your shoulders and let stiffness leave through your fingertips. She says movement is a friendly exit for tension. She says schedule worry for a specific 10 minutes. She says write everything down and close the page. She says live the rest of the day as if worry kept its appointment. She says learn to receive compliments with simple gratitude. She says receiving is part of the flow of giving. She says let the flow run both directions. She says your home can become your teammate. She says set it up so that good choices are easy and bad choices are inconvenient. She says teammates make victory more likely. She says practice finning. She says even small completions teach your mind to trust your word. She says trust in yourself reduces wasted energy. She says prepare for joy with the same care you prepare for challenges. She says clear space on your shelf and in your schedule. She says joy arrives where it has somewhere to sit. She says your patience will soon pay you in surprising currency. She says the reward may be calm, clarity, or a door you did not see. She says accept the form it takes. She says your inner weather matters. She says choose thoughts that make clear skies more likely. She says cloud management is a daily practice. She says you will hear your name spoken softly in a moment of doubt. She says take that as a nudge to proceed. She says courage often speaks in a whisper. She says it is safe to be proud of how far you have come. She says pride in progress is not arrogance when paired with humility. She says hold both like two steady hands. She says you can lighten your evening by choosing a stopping point on purpose. She says step back while you still have a little energy left. She says the next day will thank you for the leftover spark. She says ask your body what it needs and believe the first simple answer. She says answers sound like water, rest, movement, or quiet. She says obedience to simple needs multiplies strength. She says your values can decide in rooms where your emotions are allowed. She says reach for the list and let it speak. She says decisions made by values age well. She says your finances deserve clarity and calm names. She says give every unit of money a job before it arrives. She says name money behaves. She says there is a window of goodness opening in the next few weeks. She says prepare by cleaning up lingering messes. She says readiness and opportunity and joy meet each other. She says you will sleep better when your last words to the day are grateful. She says gratitude tucks the night in. She says dreams like sleeping under that blanket. She says a letter from your own heart wants to be written and sealed. She says write it as if you were your best friend. She says seal it with a promise you intend to keep. She says conflict handled with respect can deepen trust. She says breathe, lower your voice, and choose truth over winning. She says trust grows in such weather. She says replace one complaint with a request today. She says requests invite solutions while complaints invite more noise. She says this swap changes outcomes. She says your future self is watching you with kindness. She says they are grateful you kept going on days like this. She says make them proud with one clean action. She says choose mentors in your memories as well. She says remember how she solved problems with presence and patience. She says try that method and see peace return. She says carry a small joy in your pocket. He says a note, a photo, or a word can turn a moment around. She says pockets are good places for sunshine. She says you already have what you need to take the next step. She says the proof is in your steady breath and willing heart. She says step now and let the path reveal itself. She says when you feel alone, open a window and greet the air. She says air carries echo and blessing. She says you will feel met in a way that eases the tight places. She says your kindness to yourself is a message to everyone. She says it says that people can be human near you. She says that message is a rare and healing gift. She says keep a promise to your creativity this week. She says keep it like you would keep a promise to a child. She says creativity grows where promises are kept. She says sit with a warm drink and notice the quiet details around you. She says your life is full of helpers that ask for nothing. She says honoring them is a form of prayer without words. She says measure success by alignment and not by spectacle. She says aligned days feel like your own shoes. She says spectacle is loud and quickly tired. He says you can be a beginner again and again. She says beginning is a doorway to dignity, not a mark of failure. She says walk through with curiosity. She says your name, when spoken with love, clears the inner air. She says say it now with warmth. He says let the warmth soak in. She says take a photograph of something ordinary that comforts you. She says save it where you can find it fast. She says this will be your pocket window on hard hours. She says practice leaving a room slower than you entered. She says that small pause returns your power. He says power held gently is power used well. He says a soft yes to your calling each morning is enough. She says the yes grows louder through action. She says action teaches the world how to receive you. She says your sleep tonight will carry instruction. She says keep a pen near the bed. She says write what you remember before it fades. She says she is close when the room feels suddenly lighter. She says that lightness is her hand smoothing the air. She says breathe it in and continue. She says tomorrow wants the gift of your presence more than your perfection. She says show up with honest effort. She says honest effort multiplies results over time. She says keep this conversation near I like a folded letter. She says unfold it when you need steady eyes on your life. She says she will meet you there, again and again, with the same gentle certainty.